Greetings and welcome to the first in a series of video lectures that we'll have this semester for English 201 Early American Literature. First off, I just wanted to give you a sense of the purpose of these video lectures. Essentially, this is the same kind of content that would be covered in a face-to-face class. The intention behind the presentations is to provide additional and really essential context to help you understand what it is that you're reading in a way that would be very difficult or maybe even impossible to do on your own without that context, because in a lot of ways this class is as much about history as it is about literature. The two really cannot be disentwined from each other. So rather than giving you lots of additional reading to do on context and history, I thought it might be a little bit more fun and engaging to do what I would normally do in a face-to-face class and present it in the form of PowerPoint. Speaking of PowerPoint, I know it's kind of an old-fashioned presentation tool, but it's really the best we have for this kind of thing, and I do not want to do the death by PowerPoint. I'm going to do everything I can to keep these lectures as brief, but also as informative as possible. Of course, you are not forced to watch the entire video in one go. That's the nice thing about it, is you can kind of pick it up and put it down as you need to. If your dog starts barking or you need to get up and go to the bathroom or get something to drink, whatever kind of drink you like, coffee or whatever, you can do that. Or if you're the kind of person who really needs to see it through from one end to the other, you can do that. And again, I'll try not to have them run too terribly long, because I, like most people, don't want to watch insanely long YouTube videos either. There is always going to be a PDF version of the PowerPoint that is presented in these videos, and also a selection of links to the videos that would normally be shown in a face-to-face class. You should be able to click on those links in the PDF version and go straight there, or I've also given them to you in a folder that says corresponding videos. It could be a good idea to make it kind of as authentic to the class experience as possible to pause the video periodically and click on the link to watch the video, much like we would do in class. You probably would have a better understanding of why they're there if you watched them at those points in the presentation versus waiting until afterward and then just watching them in all one long go, because this particular unit does have a lot of videos to go with it because it is about performance, and it's hard for me to just describe performance to you. It's definitely better for you to be able to see it for yourself, and they're pretty interesting. So another thing, just quickly before we launch into the content, mini assignments. So when I say assignment, these are not necessarily for grades. What I normally do in a face-to-face class is I put up on the screen periodically throughout the presentation, kind of break it up, a task of some kind, usually finding specific examples from the assigned readings. And then I would have students break into groups, and I would have them look for those examples, mark them in their book, and then we go around the room and people offer them up, we put them on the board. This is pretty crucial toward success on discussion board assignments, because it gives students content that they can then go back and use later for those assignments. So that is one of the things it's meant to do. Also, just a little word to the wise, a lot of the test questions for tests 1 and 2 are going to come from those mini assignments. So not a bad idea to at least write them down so you have them for later to help you with preparing for the tests. I just thought you'd like to know. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with some content. So we are discussing Native American oral literatures today, which is part of our Native American literature course unit. Oh, I want to apologize just really quickly. I noticed that when I go back and watch the recording of this, that there is a little yellow circle that kind of follows me wherever I go with the mouse, and I apologize for that. I know it's kind of annoying, and I'll try not to have the mouse whizzing around over the PowerPoint slides too much, because that would drive me crazy if I had to watch it too. Anyway, Native American oral literatures. Before we get into that, one of the things I like to start with in my, again, face-to-face class, and I want to make sure you get the same kind of context that they're getting, is the, albeit broad question of what is culture. Throughout our semester together over the course of readings, which are going to go basically from early Native American works to the start of the Civil War. If you want to go further than that, you have to take American Lit too. The question of what culture is and how it is made and how it is enforced and who is part of a culture and who is outside of a culture is going to come up over and over and over again. So for that reason, I like to start the course with this initial question of what actually is culture. Normally what I would have students do is, again, group up, and they'd come up with a list or a definition of what they as a group think culture means. Sometimes they come up with specific examples, like concrete examples, cultural artifacts and objects and different ways that we express ourselves culturally, communicate culturally, which I welcome you right now to just kind of pause, take a moment to, maybe make your own list, or just think to yourself, okay, when I hear the word culture, what comes to mind for me? What are some specific things that come to mind? Maybe you're thinking about where you live, or where you are in history, or all the history that's led up to the present moment, or you're thinking about politics, you're thinking about religion, you're thinking about ethnicity, you're thinking, all of those things, it's all of those things and more. Of course, we could go on and on and on. But instead of doing that, just take a moment to kind of reflect on the question for a second, and then I'll give you the official definition going forward. Culture. If you've ever taken an anthropology class or even a sociology class, you've probably been exposed to this definition before, but culture is defined as a system of beliefs and values by which people organize their experience of the world. There are no groups of people in the world or throughout any point of known history that have not had some form of culture. It just isn't possible to be a human and not have the imprint, the thumbprint of culture on you. Now, are cultures different? Absolutely. I think that's a given. But at the end of the day, what every culture has at its core is that it is a way that people are united, also divided from each other, and it is a way that they make sense of the world around them. And it takes multiple people in order to have a culture. You can't have a culture of one. Even if your culture has individualistic values, much like American culture does, still, that's a cultural value, and what makes it a cultural value is that it's one that's shared. So that's kind of ironic that we share individualistic values. Just take a moment to chew on that. All right, moving on. So when we talk about culture, especially in literature, we have to look at it through different lenses. And all of these different lenses or contexts overlap with each other. They don't exist independently of each other, but they're all essential toward understanding, again, the context or the purpose, meaning behind what we're reading. So just as kind of I like Venn diagrams. So a good way to think about cultural context is in the form of Venn diagram. Again, everything sort of overlapping. So all of these different contexts influence culture, and culture influences these contexts as well. Even something like geography, which you would think is impervious to change. Few things change as much as geography. Now, even physical landscapes can be changed to fit cultural values. For instance, if you think about, if a cultural value is to concentrate groups of people in an area that doesn't have a lot of water, then you're going to change the physical landscape to get water to that area. Las Vegas wouldn't exist without cultural context and changing of geography. But in the same way, the geography and topography where people live impacts the kind of culture that they have. And that's something that we'll see come up again and again throughout our readings, not just the Native American readings, but our other literature as well, because America is such a geographically diverse place, and different regions have different concerns, different struggles, different priorities, and those are going to impact all kinds of other aspects of life. Religion. Okay, so that's another thing that's going to come up a lot throughout the course, and regardless of where you stand personally on the topic of religion, one thing cannot be denied. It is historically undeniable that religion has, various religions and religious beliefs have fundamentally and irrevocably shaped the nation that we live in over the course of its history. And it's going to come up again and again over the course of the semester. History, of course, everything leading up to that moment in time when a text was created. With Native American texts in particular, this is a little bit tricky because the Native American concept of history is different than Western concept in that time is not thought of in the same way. Past, present, and future are thought to kind of disappear, especially when it comes to storytelling, which is kind of an interesting thought experiment, but also we kind of do the same thing when we lose ourselves in stories. We can be transported to the past, we can be sent to the future, and that's one of the miracles of storytelling and the imagination. But for Native American people, it goes beyond imagination. It's actually about revisiting in real time the history of their ancestors. Society. So when we say society, that's a pretty vague term, but we're basically talking about people. The people you're surrounded by right now and how we organize ourselves in terms of hierarchies, family structures, kinship groups, friendship groups. Of course, again, those things are impacted by religion, by geography, and by the history leading up to us or them. Okay, now that we got that out of the way. Myth. Okay, so a lot of times when people think of the word myth, they think of fictional stories, but they are much, much more than that. So if you think about a fictional story, let's say like Harry Potter, which is great and has its own, as we might say, mythology. There's a whole kind of universe with its own characters and settings and everything that people get pretty obsessed with, and rightly so. It's great. That's not quite the same as the myth that we're talking about at all, because the myth that we're talking about serves several functions in the life of a group or a community in a way that goes beyond the ways that fiction can impact us, which it certainly does, but it's just not the same. Probably the most important function that myths serve is to help give a sense of definition, a sense of identity, and a sense of commonality to the group that has that myth or shares that myth. Again, culture has to be shared between a group. Myths are the same way. And by examining a group's myths, their folk tales, their fairy tales, which we'll kind of lump together, we can learn a lot about that group's beliefs and values. So Andrew Wygant, who is one of the editors of your textbook and who wrote several essays that appear throughout the text, defines myth as the dramatic representation of culturally important truths in narrative form. So there's a lot to unpack in that definition, but culturally important truths, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that in this presentation. And narrative basically means story. So again, when we think of stories, we think of things like Harry Potter, but human beings cannot live without narrative. We are constantly constructing narratives about ourselves, about others, and if there isn't a narrative, we will make one. Human beings are drawn to narratives. That's how we make sense of the world. I mean, think about children. If you want to teach a child a lesson, lecturing them is usually not the best way to go. But if you tell them a story, like let's say the Berenstain Bears, I remember the one thing that got me to stop chewing my nails as a little girl was to read the story about called Lizzie Nibbles Her Nails. That was the little sister bear. And for some reason, it stuck with me in a way that all the lecturing from my parents in the world just couldn't do. So adults are much the same way. We use narrative to pass along, transmit, understand culturally important truths, among other things. So myth represents shared visions of the world. So for a group of people to be able to work together and be coherent as a society, they have to have shared visions. And this is one of the things that makes human beings uniquely human in a way that animals cannot do. And it's shared intentionality, shared vision. Now, can animals work together to accomplish goals? Absolutely, they do it all the time. I mean, think of a pack of wolves. But they